So what distinguishes Pax Americana from Pax Britannia and what came before is, unlike all of the Paxes of the past, the American period was not an empire. When you're an empire, you use your military force to force your way upon the world and extract economic concessions. You establish customs units, you skim off the top. The United States didn't do it that way because the United States wasn't interested in the economic side of dominating the world. We saw it as a security problem. At the end of World War II, we found ourselves facing down the Red Army a continent away, and we knew in order to contain it and beat it back that we needed to have a deep roster of allies who were willing to be cannon fodder in the case that there was a new war. And so we bribed them. We created globalization and used our Navy so that any of them could go anywhere at any time and interface with any partner and access any market. We basically paid them to be on our sides. In compensation, we got to write their security policies. And that is the Cold War order. That is the Bretton Woods system. That is the order, as I call it. And it lasted until the Soviet Union died. But then in '92, we voted down the guy who wanted to reform it, and we had a succession of ever more populist and isolationist leaders, culminating with Joe Biden. And now we have the most economically populist foreign policy that we have seen in this country in well over a century. And the Americans just are not holding up the ceiling anymore.
So you're saying this decline, this change of order could have been avoided?
It's possible. We had a moment back with George Herbert Walker Bush. You remember 1,000 Points of Light in the New World Order, that conversation, where he tried to get us to have a national conversation about what we wanted out of the world. Now that the Cold War was over, what did we want to leave for our children? And we voted him out of office for trying to have that conversation. Yeah, without a serious overhaul, it was always going to fail. Because when this was established in the 1940s, the United States was a larger economy than everyone else in the world put together by all meaningful measures. But year by year by year, as the United States basically encouraged everyone else to grow, we used our military capacity and our access to our market to underwrite the entire alliance. You do that for 75 years, and collectively the rest of the world got powerful, and more powerful economically, to the point that the United States, even if it wanted to continue de facto subsidizing everything, couldn't. There's a military aspect. Post-Soviet period, we changed the way our Navy works. We concentrated all of our power in the supercarriers. We don't have a lot of destroyers anymore. We couldn't patrol the global oceans now, even if we wanted to. And part of it is demographic. After 75 years of industrialization and urbanization, the very population structure of the world changed. And in most of the world now, especially in the advanced world, there are more people in their 60s than their 50s than their 40s than their 30s than their 20s than their teens. And we now have such a top-heavy demographic that's full of people who produce, who are now on the verge of retirement, that there aren't enough people to sell to. The US market is really the only one of size that still has a lot of young people. All those millennials that we keep maligning, they've got something going for them that their cohorts around the world don't. They exist. And there's no longer sufficient consumption on a global basis to support the productive capacity that's out there. So approach this strategically and militarily, or approach it demographically and economically. It doesn't have much time left. There are a lot of countries out there that have followed different demographic patterns. I mean, everybody has started living longer and everyone has had a lower birth rate, but there's a lot of variation within the themes. The Mexicans didn't start going through this transition until the 90s. The Germans started it before World War II. Some did it slow, some did it fast. I don't think there's much of a paradox here, because unless we did it as a planet, all at the same rate, it's really hard to draw an ideological argument as to how we might have done it different or better. The problem is that once the birth rate started to drop, with like a half a dozen exceptions globally, none of them ever picked up. You urbanize, you have fewer kids. There are very few exceptions to that trend. The prominent one is in the United States, where we had the suburbs. Suburbs in the United States mean something different than suburbs in most other countries. In most other countries, the suburbs are slums. Here, single-family homes rule. And if you have a yard, you can have more kids. So there's a cultural and a geographic element here that I think a lot of the ideologies that debate the consumption issue miss. And that's one of the reasons why the United States is actually reasonably well positioned here. I mean, like I said, the millennials exist. There isn't the equivalent of the millennials in Britain or in Germany or in Italy or Korea or Japan or China. And for the next 40 years, that is going to make all the difference. I mean, we're not going to suffer nearly as much on the slide down as everyone else because we're not dealing with the collapses in finance and consumption or military security that a lot of other places are. But at the same time, we're looking at, in the next few years at the Chinese and the German systems dissolving as economic players. That means that if we want to have manufactured goods in North America, we have to build them here, which means we need to roughly double the size of the industrial plant. Will that be inflationary? Oh yeah. But it will also be the greatest economic growth story in the history of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Record growth is not something that scares me.
Finance, transport, energy, agriculture, manufacturing. What are some of the most important of those aspects, and which ones will have the greatest shocks to the system, you think?
Well, agriculture, manufacturing, those are ones that I think most people understand the concept that you can only do certain things in certain places, that there's concentrations of activity. So if you change the balance of the game, where you do that moves around. So for example, in the agricultural sector, a lot of the fertilizer production comes from the former Soviet world. That's in the process of falling offline. So if you have a soil type like in Brazil that just requires more fertilizer in order to grow anything, you're in trouble. I think that plays to people's mental bandwidth. I think the more important issues are the things that kind of operate under the hood. We don't necessarily think of every day because we assume that there's no problem. Transport's a great example. The concept of being able to move anything at scale anywhere in the world at a very low cost, reliably, with no security cost whatsoever, historically speaking, that is a laughable concept, but it's indelibly woven into how we think of the world today. I mean, you only have to go back a century and a half to get to a period when it was cheaper to move things from London to Massachusetts as opposed to moving them from Massachusetts to New York on a road. And we're moving into a world where international transport is not going to be safe. And in that sort of a world, everything about our current manufacturing, energy, agriculture, everything else breaks down, and transport becomes a local and a regional concern instead of a national one. And that forces a complete reimagining of how the world works. Same thing in finance.
Just to touch on that, because earlier you talked about the retooling of the American Navy towards supercarriers and away from destroyers, and this change in guarantees of naval safety, which you just came to again. Do you see rampant high seas piracy ahead for the world?
Privacy, state piracy, and pirating, and piracy, state piracy, and privateering. All three of them I see coming back in a very big way.
Aside from the Horn of Africa, is this going on right now? I mean, we hear about Somali pirates and that kind of thing, but it seems
At the moment, we're seeing piracy in places that are kind of in the no man's land between the major economic zones. So if you think today of the major zones as the Brazilian coast, the American coasts, the European system, the Chinese system, the Indian system, and the Persian Gulf system, those areas have negligible piracy at all. And we have very few zones that are in between where the rule of law on the sea exists, or where it doesn't exist. And that's where we see piracy. What I'm saying is that when you break down some of these bigger blocks and they can no longer function, and the writ of the state is no longer able to provide regional security, then we have more of those zones. And the more of them that we have, the more countries will have a vested interest in disrupting trade for their own reasons. I would argue that the country to watch the most robustly as the United States kind of backs away from things is India, because they're the first major country out of the Persian Gulf, and there is no way in hell they will let themselves have an energy crisis if they can avoid it.